All right, this is episode 2. Why talk about sex and sexuality?
Yeah, there's a lot here. We kind of skipped right over this when we dove into defining what sex is. It's like, wait a minute, why do we do this?
I think it's so great and so important to get into this question specifically. What are we doing here?
I had this thought as I'm, as you know, out in the world chatting with people about some of the work that we do as sexuality educators, that I'm quite used to that now, and I feel pretty comfortable talking about, well, I do sex ed, but recognizing sometimes sort of the shock on people's faces and not giving them the preamble as to why. Like, what does this impact? Why did I get here? Why me?
Big questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it changes your life to become a sex educator. It changes the way you relate to people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And yes, I sometimes find a kind of distance coming in, or we don't want to talk about that anymore.
Which, interestingly, I often don't get from the young people, but that's a conversation for another day. And by young, I mean elementary aged.
They're more
pre-puberty. I think
they're more curious.
Yes, more curious and less of a sort of, I'm going to immediately dissociate from this conversation. Or, oh God, if I engage with her, she's going to ask me something worse. So, yeah.
She's going to say things.
Which, for the context for anyone listening, by ask, I mean like things like volunteering or engaging in the topic, not like personal sexual questions, which would be wildly inappropriate. And I don't ask people in the context as an educator. So,
do you ever find that you share the work that you're doing and people respond by giving personal stories of their own lives?
Oh, gosh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's also part of the why I sort of intuitively, I've never asked you this, but feel that this might have been the case for you as well that might be part of why you ended up as a sex educator. I've certainly always been a person who receives information and deep dives and intimate, sometimes trauma-based or emotional information from people at like a pretty early level. So I think I signal to people that I'm kind of a safe space and safe person. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I think just saying I do sex education, often people are disclosing, and I sometimes struggle with not the holding space for them. I actually love that. I think disclosures, and I guess I'm interested to hear what kind of disclosures you get. I often get people who either received very poor sex ed as a young person and that was detrimental to them, that did them some harm, and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you do this. Here's my story of harm. Mm. Or they have some abuse or sexual violence in their past and are almost, I think, dying for a safe space to say that because it's such a common human experience and so taboo to talk about. So
that's great. And I come off as a safe person.
You do to me. Just for clarity.
Cari. I don't think that I experienced a lot of disclosures prior to coming into sex education. And we can get into our personal stories a little bit later. But I do tend to, it was very abrupt. Like I decided I was going into this and almost right away people approached me to share stories of often, like you said, their own sex ed experiences that they found to be inadequate, or other types of personal experiences that they clearly want to share with people.
Yeah.
That there isn't much invitation or space to do that.
I love that you said invitation because I feel like for me, sexuality is so multifaceted, meaning it isn't really just about the physical acts of sex and isn't necessarily just something that happens behind closed doors. And I certainly think it impacts a lot of our social structures, even though it's sometimes in sort of a nuanced and subtle way. But there are not very many spaces, particularly as an adult. I think when you're a very young person in high school, college, there are some spaces where you're allowed to be dating and talking about sex. But then you become a, quote, adult with a capital A, and you're expected to like quietly talk about that with like a counselor, maybe your partner if you have good communication, and then maybe you've got a best friend or two that will occasionally indulge you. But like people don't have space to talk about their sexuality.
And it matters so much.
So much. Yeah.
It's such an important part of life.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm so glad you brought up sex and sexuality. Those are two words that we use. And in our last episode, we did talk about what does sex mean.
We did.
And can you give us a quick recap? Do you remember the
I'm not sure I remember all of them in the right order, so you might have to help me out. Maybe we have to refer to our notes.
Let's see. We talked about genital contact.
Yes.
Because
we do need to have some guardrails on. It can't just be a fluid. I winked at the barista at the coffee shop. I don't know why I said that. I've never winked at a barista. I don't wink. I would never do that.
It's hard to do.
It's super hard. I don't look cool. I end up with like a very, for anyone
kind
listening, I am trying to wink now, and it doesn't look at all sensual. Nobody would find that. They'd be like, she has a twitch. But it is important to have the physical and genital contact, I think, to give some guardrails to what we mean when we're talking about sex.
Right. And pleasure, consent on all parties, and satisfaction.
Yeah, I love those.
Yeah.
And something, since we've recorded our last episode where we defined sex that I'm not sure if we explicitly said in our previous definition, but I think it's super important for people to maybe know why we included pleasure and satisfaction, is that there are, times where people experience consensual sexual contact. And I think it's super important that we don't muddy the waters and include that with consensual sex, because I think those are acts of violence. And part of my ethics is that I need those to be kind of separate things because our society sometimes gives very conflicting messages about sexual violence. And I think separating the two things out can be clarifying for people. So that's, I think, really important.
There are many ways to use a baseball bat, but they aren't all playing baseball.
I have never heard that, and I love it. That perfectly summarizes how I feel about the need for that pleasure and satisfaction and consent, whatever that looks like for the parties involved.
Mm-hmm. So sexuality is this much bigger idea, right? And so you mentioned emotions, relationships, intimacy.
Yeah.
Yes. As all dimensions of sexuality.
For sure.
And we could add identity to that, power dynamic.
For sure. When you talk about institutions and societal ways that society is giving us messages about sexuality, a lot of that is power dynamic and power exchange and how our institutions are set up. And you don't necessarily link those to acts of sex. That's definitely a more expansive part of our sexuality as humans.
Great. So just to be clear about what that all means. And maybe we can get into that more in a future episode. Yeah. We'll see how that goes. Why is sex education important then?
Well, I can answer my sort of, I should clarify for anyone listening, I tend to not be a super clinical person. There are really awesome documents from like the World Health Organization and far more rigorous scientific and clinically backed, documents from a public health standpoint and like a sociology standpoint for why sex ed really matters. Just for me as a human, I tend to have like a slightly more personal view of why it matters in my own life. There's kind of, I think this quote was attributed to Oscar Wilde, but it's something to the effect of everything is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. And I, looking over my lifetime, sexuality has been such a significant part of all of my stages of development. And And I don't mean sexual contact, I mean sexuality. And part of that identity and values, the power exchanges, in having open dialogue about it in safe places that's not from, say, the media and like messages about sexuality and what's normal and what isn't, and power from the media. So having like a safe educational grounding experience, particularly for young people, but also adults, I think has like a ripple effect in every other aspect of life. And I want to be part of that. I want young people to feel good about their bodies, have high self-confidence, have spaces to explore their identities and not have that be politicized. So those are kind of my motivations. The public health aspect obviously is super important to me too. I don't want people to have, negative health outcomes. Family planning is super important. I don't even know why I use the word family planning. I don't love it. Reproductive care and being able to have reproductive choices, super important. And I don't want to politicize that in this episode, but there's all kinds of stuff happening in the world that make access to reproductive care and even just like information about our bodies very hard to get to. So that's important to me, but I'm definitely more grounded in the identity and wanting young people to feel good about themselves. And not to get on my soapbox, but I think when people feel good about themselves and their identity and have spaces to work through potentially some of the harmful messages, they are better members of society. So I think they're more connected to other people. I think there's less violence in the world. And I think that ripple effect makes the world brighter and better. So that's my why it matters. How about you?
I mean, I agree with everything you just said. I think also I would describe it as tools and building capacity for healthy relationships with ourselves and others.
Yeah.
Understanding ourselves and forming genuine, honest human connection.
I love that.
And if you have knowledge and understanding of this aspect of life, that is a crucial tool. Okay. So that's why education specifically matters as opposed to other dimensions of engaging with our sexual lives or reflecting on our sexual lives. If we have knowledge, then we have the ability to make good choices for ourselves.
Yeah.
Without that, we can't. So that's why sex education is particularly important to me in general, right? For kids, adults, etc.
And one thing, you just used the word knowledge. I love etc. I love the word knowledge because we live in a world full of information. You can Google a lot of these questions, but the information doesn't necessarily give you any personal level of knowledge about the topic. So I think that's really helpful because you can read about sex and sexuality on Google and get to some interesting places. So I think knowledge is the thing.
Knowledge being a kind of synthesis.
Yeah, a synthesis. And for me, often knowledge is about engaging with other humans, right?
Oh, interesting.
You can read
that makes sense.
Yeah. For something like sexuality, it's definitely like you can read a list of facts, but having a dialogue with other people to synthesize that information and understand what that means in a broader context is super important to me. That's what I consider as a person, as a human, to be learning.
So I like that because we're both talking about individuals then, and we're talking about individuals in the relationships that they have, not just their sexual relationships, but friendships and maybe family relationships like parents and kids.
Yeah.
Needing to talk about sex and sexuality and the community that we and society that we exist in. It's all connected. So why sex education for adults? Because that's we are clear in our podcast that we want to talk about sex ed for adults as well as parenting.
For sure.
And those being two separate concepts.
Yes.
Sex ed for adults has to do with questions that adults might be having about their own sexual lives, experiences, identities, relationships, etc., separately from what it means to be a parent and how to parent kids through their own sexual understanding of themselves.
Yeah. And I think the two things can sometimes feel murky and interconnected. I'm speaking for myself as a parent. And so I think it's important to distinctly separate out those two things, because what you're bringing to the table as a parent can sometimes be very impactful to how you're parenting your child. So I think many of us as parents, I certainly did have had my young person come up to me, while I'm doing dishes and say, specifically, how does the baby get inside the uterus? And you go, and it's always earlier than I was expecting it to be. And the feelings are big, and I'm pretty comfortable, right? And I still have that not yet kind of feeling, which is about me and not my kid. So definitely important to have spaces for adults. And then I can also speak to a little bit of my own personal journey for why I'm recognizing the world needs more spaces for adults to talk about sexuality and their sexual lives. I am a divorced mom out in the world dating. And I won't go into a ton of detail about, dating apps and the way that the digital world has, I think, changed the landscape of people relating to each other. But I don't think that it's inflammatory to say I find that people are struggling and that there are not spaces for people to talk about how they're struggling. I think many people do like one-on-one therapy, but that doesn't really give you a safe space to chat with your peers about what's happening in your own. Maybe it's your sex life, maybe it's your identity. I'm sure we could do a whole show about, marriages changing over time, what it's like to date and have sex after divorce, right? There's just so much that happens over the course of our lifetime. So much.
And that's a great point. So those are experiences you're having now, which are very different from mine, by the way. I've been with the same person since I was 20. So kind of skip the whole dating thing in some ways.
In some ways, many of us would tell you that's a blessing.
I am fascinated, Cari, and I'm looking forward to hearing more. So that's really important, because therapy is a very personal, very individualized space.
Yes.
And what you're talking about is the need to be able to have these conversations in the larger community.
Yes.
Which is part of what we hope to do with a podcast.
Yeah. And I think we also just touched on super important. We are an inclusive space. People are bringing their own life experience and sex lives and relationships. And I strive to create space without a value judgment about any one of those experiences. From monogamously coupled to I don't know what I'm doing, to divorced and dating, to asexual, and still I want the space to be embracing for all people, because those are all valid life experiences.
Absolutely.
And
there are definitely issues and questions that come up with being in a long-term partnership as well. And there's, as you grow and as adults, we're always changing. And there's sometimes this perception that now we know what sex is. There's nothing more to talk about.
Yep. You figured it out, so it's fine.
We had health class.
Yeah, it's fine. You're an adult now. Yeah.
When really that's not the case. There's so much that develops over time. Sexuality is lifelong.
Yeah.
As we say in our intro.
Yeah. Whole life cycle. So we've talked a little bit about why sex and sexuality, why education, and then a little bit about why we want to educate or talk about specifically developmentally appropriate adult issues. Issues sounded very clinical. I don't know why I picked that word. Adult topics. Do we want to get into why each of us has gotten into the actual space and role of being a sexuality educator? Because I certainly have a sort of a personal life path that led me here.
Of
and
course.
I'm sure you do too.
Yes, let's share a bit more of ourselves as part of what we're doing here.
Yeah. I sort of intuitively feel like it's good to pass the baton off to Nina, because you specifically started this nonprofit and this community-based program that I facilitate and teach through. So I wouldn't have found this curriculum if you hadn't done that. So it feels like I'd like to hear about how you got there.
Okay, great. Yes. So I have been a sexuality educator now for 11 years.
Cool.
And the way that started for me was my older child was 3 years old, and I was pregnant with my second. And exactly as you described, how did the baby get in there, Mom? And I knew I wanted to give accurate information that needed to be age appropriate, and I wasn't sure what that even looked like.
For sure.
I didn't want to give too much or the wrong kind of information, but I knew that I wanted something different from what I had experienced.
Yeah.
Which is something we hear all the time now.
For sure.
I knew about this curriculum as part of, I belong to a church, a denomination called the Unitarian Universalists, which has been doing sex education for 50 years now, I think. So I was familiar with this curriculum called Our Whole Lives. And I knew that this is a lifespan curriculum, and it has programs or curricula classes for every age level, from young childhood to older adulthood. And so I decided to look into that, and I started an OWL program. Our Whole Lives is often called OWL, in the community that I was living in at the time, and that was in partnership with my church, but also a community programs. There were families who were not part of the church who were engaged in the program. That's where I started. There are deeper whys for me there.
Yeah.
At that time, when I was pregnant with my second, I was a professor of philosophy. And my area of research was relationships.
Nice.
Specifically the ethics and normativity of interpersonal relationships, both on an individual level and a social political level. And so I have background writing, reading, working in this space of thinking about what it means for people to be connected to others and the complications, many complications of that. Now I've left academia, and I am a full-time sex educator now. But I see that work as continuous because it's another way of working on interpersonal relationships and in some ways, much more directly supporting healthy relationships.
Yeah.
Another aspect of that is that personally, as a Unitarian Universalist, I grew up in this and did sex education with my church in 8th grade, which went way beyond what the schools were offering, not surprisingly. So it was through that program, for me, where I was in 8th grade, it was that I could not think about the word sex. I could not say the word sex.
For sure.
We would say doing it and then giggle.
Oh, yes. Doing it.
We were doing it. Were they doing it? Oh, my God.
Love that.
So it was really sort of this black hole in my mind.
Yeah.
I had internalized that taboo so deeply that I could not really even approach the subject.
Yeah.
And it took going through this class for me to really get to a place where I could calmly and considerately in a regulated space, as we would say now.
Yeah.
Contemplate sex, sexual activities, sexual behaviors, sexual choices.
Yeah.
Consider my relationship with my own body, with other people, and make good. And I credit that with being able to have made good choices for myself.
Yeah.
So that was a real change in my life, and that's had a big influence on my life ever since. And so that also, I guess, is part of my story of why I wanted to be part of sex education rather than maybe donating money or supporting healthy sexual life in other ways.
For sure. Well, thank you for sharing. I had heard kind of Cliff Notes versions of some of that, but I love the personal tie back. And I'm also shout out to Oak Park Owl for maybe giving that experience to some other 8th graders.
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. How about you, Cari?
Yeah, so interesting to hear your kind of why. And I have maybe a slightly parallel, maybe a little bit different, but parallel experiences. I previously have not done any formal or paid work in education, although I would say in every aspect of my life I've ended up as an educator. So I worked as a corporate trainer, and I think some of us gravitate towards the way that I learn about the world. I feel like I absorb information. I kind of pull from different places. I like to synthesize it. And I kind of touched on this earlier. For me, knowledge is then about sharing that with other people. That's how I solidify knowledge. It's sort of like a trial and error, right? You find information, you might share it with other people. They might give you some feedback. So I've always felt like my own just human experience improves as I educate other people. And for me, it's often collaborative, and I don't consider myself to be a very authoritative educator. I really feel like we all can get something from other people. And so that's specifically what I like about training, education, and classroom experience. So maybe a little self-absorbed. It's quite expanding for me as a person. And I have always been the friend in almost every developmental stage of my life, as far back as I can remember. I don't know where it comes from or what even the words are for it, who has existed in a space where I allow other people, sometimes other people that are sort of on the fringes, to connect with me. It's something that is integral to who I am. Some of my earliest school age memories are that I was often the only kiddo. I had a kindergarten and first grade classroom that included several kids with physical disabilities. And I can remember not being aware that I wasn't supposed to chat with those people until it was pointed out by the adults. And a lot of that sort of same iteration of that experience, over and over in my life, sort of does the double down and reinforces that we have a lot of social rules about what topics are allowed to be talked about. So in that instance, I loved the electric wheelchair that my friend had. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I didn't see why I shouldn't ask about it. He wasn't super verbal, but he had an aid and he could do some writing and communicating. I thought his wheelchair was the coolest thing ever. Also, his mom had a van with one of those ramp things, and I was like, that's my best friend. I was like, I'm in it.
That's fun.
And then as I grew and as, sex and sexuality became a topic, I was always the friend that was down to hold space for people to share their new experiences, or if they read a thing or their parent gave them a book or they saw that, tintillating thing in the early days, really pre-internet. So it would usually be a VHS tape or a magazine someone found. And then as I aged into a person that was dating, I was the person who wanted to debrief with people. Consensually, of course, but wanted to debrief with people. I discovered this cool new thing, or I tried this new thing, or are you guys having this experience? And I carried that through my adult life. And then through my experience of a very challenging divorce, I took all those like little interpersonal skills that I learned, and I really recognized in both my own journey and other, particularly cis het women's journeys through divorce court, that all those small experiences of like scuttling to your room with like the, pornographic magazine that you found to like debrief, like, is this how women, like, why doesn't she have any hair? Like, all those tiny experiences are ones that are quite common and then inform our societal structures like family court, the institution of marriage. And for me, did deep harm to me on like a catastrophic level. So my divorce was very difficult. Economically, it was very difficult for me as a mom. It informed my parenting. So as I'm divorcing and in the depths of the pandemic, work from home, solo momming, I saw one of the like flyers that Oak Park Owl sends out for facilitating. And I had that kind of in the back of my mind. And I thought maybe this is a place to find a little bit of light. Like maybe this is a space that you can share that tiny little thing that you do with some other people. And through that, and then also having the parallel experience of being on the dating apps, and I won't get on my soapbox, but it's always a little complicated about how much of my own personal sexuality I like to share. But I certainly think that I have an openness in my own dating and sex life, which I recognize is extremely unusual. And that keeps kind of like going back to that kindergarten story of like, well, why wouldn't I think the kid with the amazing wheelchair that nobody else has is the coolest kid in the classroom? We don't do a great job socially of providing space for people to talk about sex and sexuality. And that repeatedly gets played out in my dating life. And so that has also kind of been running parallel to my working with children and being like, if we could help people have that transformative experience when they're a young person, it could potentially benefit all of us down the line. And with dating in particular, it's very interesting because dating kind of sounds casual and flippant, like it's not a super big deal. But what you find when you're an adult and you're out in the world is the way people's dating and sex lives are going has pretty radical impact on the rest of their lives. And there's just been this constant, dialogue. Socially, we seem to be talking a lot about sex in our culture, but people tend to be having less sex and less satisfying sex lives. And that has been a shocking discovery for me as an adult, right? Because it's supposed to be this pleasurable, connected thing, right? To me, I'm like, this is shiny and human and like one of the greatest joys on, earth. And I'm talking about sexuality, not just acts of sex. And people are carrying so much negativity with that, ranging from just like a lack of information about how their own bodies work, all the way up to like the really kind of dark transactional power exchanges that happen in dating and some kind of difficult gender stuff about, well, I'll never call him back if he doesn't pay for the first date. And then just all this pain that's surrounding what I feel should be this deeply human experience. So that's a very long-winded answer, but I guess I would like to shine so brightly and hold so much space for people. Obviously, consent is important and developmentally appropriate dialogues are important. But as adults, I would like to be a beacon of light to allow people to talk about whatever it is that they need to talk about, because not talking about these stigmatized subjects, I think, is deeply painful for people. And I don't want people to be in pain. It seems like you could be experiencing great pleasure. And so why would I want people to walk around with that level of pain and shame? I can't compute. I don't get it.
It's lovely. Yeah. So there's a sense of self that that is available to us to connect with as well as to other people.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, we could get into the challenge questions a little bit, because I am always interested in what would another angle be on this, or where might someone say, hold up, wait a minute, is this really worth doing?
For sure.
Or maybe all of our good intentions are backfiring in ways that we can't
Yeah.
see.
Which I think, I guess, side note, I am interested in having that conversation because for the parenting aspect, often what I hear about from parents that aren't comfortable or are trying to figure out what's developmentally appropriate, I think we do carry a lot of, what if this is doing harm? What if I say the wrong thing? What if talking about it doesn't make it better? And I think that's like a very common fear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was where I was coming from.
Yeah.
Was how do I say this in a way that is not harmful?
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly that there are indications that people are having less sex.
Yeah.
Across all age levels, particularly younger people. Between 2009 and 2018, the proportion of adolescents reporting no sexual activity, either alone or with partners, rose from 28.8% to 44.2%.
Interesting.
Among young men. This says adolescents. And from 49% to 74% among young women.
Wow. Okay. Those are significant. I did not expect those statistics to be so such a significant change over
It's
a pretty
huge,
short
right?
time frame.
Yes, barely, almost, 9 years. That's not a long time.
No.
So
I mean, that's not
this
even a
is-
generation of kids, right? That's a significant increase in
Right.
kids not having.
And this comes from the
Sex.
long-term National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior. So one reason, and there's no, of course, we can't take data like that and easily identify a cause or an explanation. So here we get into...
And they're survey-based, right? So it's self-reported survey data. Okay.
And I know that there are limitations with the survey approach. Although one source I found was interestingly said that there are suggestions that there's less bias in reporting data than there used to be. So maybe people are more comfortable being honest about their sexual experiences. And that might be one part of the explanation for that change in that apparent decline, is that people are more comfortable being honest about the amount of sexual activity they're actually engaged in.
Yeah. What comes up for you when you hear those numbers? Because I have some sort of really some social ideas or social trends that sort of run parallel. When I hear that kind of fills in a narrative for me. I think the first thing that comes up for me when I read those, I think about social media and the internet. I think about how relating and relationships have changed, definitely since I was a young person, but since 2009. So I think about iPhones, right? I think about smartphones. And this sort of rhetoric we often hear about young people being really dialed in and connected digitally, but also then struggling with feeling more isolated and having less social connection off of their technology.
Spending less time with each other in person.
Yes.
And more time remotely.
Yes.
Yes. I think that definitely happens. But also we want to be really careful about the scapegoats.
For sure.
The phones and the social media.
Yes.
Those have become very easily pointed to. And I think there's a lot of value that they add.
Me too.
People's lives as well.
I know you and I have talked about that offline, but I'm not a digital technology hater. I think I sit with my own child and their friends, and their ability to build community through social media and use all of the various digital tools we have is pretty awesome. And they have access to parts of the world that I would never have had access to when I was their age. So I think there's a lot of beauty there and potential for deep connection. I just think maybe it looks and feels like a little different than it did.
Right. So one One point that a researcher made was that the explanations are likely to be multiple.
For sure.
Right. And that each one of these explanations might influence the data just a small amount. And it's hard to, or we should be cautious or suspicious blaming any one aspect of life experience.
Well, and I guess when you use the word blame, maybe the thing to throw out there is this negative? Like, how do we, right? Like, is there a judgment and a value to how much sex young people are having? Does it say terrible things about us? Or does it, and again, this is not clinical. This has nothing to do with the research, but just the narrative that plays in my mind is, are we talking more about consent and coaching young people to decide when and if and how they want to have sexual contact with partners? And is that a bad thing?
Yes, good point. Good point. And hopefully it means that more people are making better choices for themselves. Yeah. And I think we definitely want to emphasize quality over quantity.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I can just vaguely speak to the anecdotal adult experience. I think what you said about quality over quantity, there's a sort of tension, I think, with things like dating apps, where you have so much access to dating profiles and the ability to really have that dopamine input of like swiping through a dating app, right? Like I can't go out into the world and just have a line of, 35 people that I can look at and say, yep, nope, yep, nope. So you've got this access, and then a dopamine rush when you connect with someone, you get a match, you get like a literal ping. It's like a game. And then a digital communication, maybe you have some messages back and forth. And there's definitely kind of a space there where I think those apps tend to often gear you towards just the quantity of sort of attention, or a little hit of joy when you win and match with someone. And I don't think that equates to having quality connection to other humans, and certainly does not lead necessarily to quality sex.
It's a great point. There are many ways in which social media enables our more shallow connections.
For sure.
Or our broad social networks.
For sure.
People would say.
For sure. Which, again, that's not necessarily a value judgment about whether that's good or bad or what I think about the direction society is going in. I think connection is profound and healthy, and I don't think digital connection is bad. But I think there's sort of a broader social or like media narrative that like people are having more sex, and people talk about young people having casual sex. And for me, kind of what comes up is the idea that like we have somewhat moved the needle, certainly in the greater Chicagoland area, and I guess depending on where you live in the country and what kind of social values are going on around you. Young people aren't getting married super young anymore. I think that there's all kinds of, like you said, there's probably many factors to that. But the sort of relationship escalator where you're supposed to, I guess I'll call out, you're supposed to be heterosexual. There's often not space for queer people in that life escalator. But date someone, go to college, get married, buy a house, have some babies. There's sort of that script that I think we've almost universally agreed everybody's on their own time frame, and maybe we don't need to have a strong script that forces people into these very specific life stages. But I think outside of that, then you often hear socially that, you know, we've destroyed family values and people are having casual sex and all this sex and it's so bad. That's kind of the messaging that I'll often hear, that sex has lost its meaning and people are just doing it everywhere because of the dating apps and it's easy to find casual sex. And I think it's interesting that that's not what the data shows us really, at all. So maybe when you get rid of the script, just maybe people have space to figure out what they really would like to be doing. And maybe there's some space for us to redefine what it looks like to have the kind of sex young people want to be having.
So, and I think that education probably has something to do with that.
Yeah.
As I think you suggested before, that when we are more educated and when we are learn that we're able to have calm, direct conversations about sex, we're better able to make good choices for ourselves and have sex when and how we want to have it, rather than falling into it or doing it because that is the expectation or the script that you're describing.
Yeah. We talked about a lot of stuff today. I hope it was helpful to hear our whys and hows, and informs all of our next episodes. Thanks.
So thank you for being curious with us here today as we got into the whys of sex and sex education. We are curious about you too. What are your whys for being here? What questions do you have, or topics that you have that you would like a safe space to discuss in, or to engage in some way?
Yeah, we're looking forward to getting into all these topics with you. Thanks for listening.